Thank you to
You
Town
bet.
and Country Federal Credit Union for hosting us again and giving us an opportunity to share our expertise and information and our own experience as parents with all of your members and customers and other perhaps school staff or students and families who've joined. I'm going to be focusing tonight on sort of the financial, preparing financially aspects and things that you can be doing now to really, as we say, get your financial house in order. We'll talk about family communication and then I'll talk a little bit about researching and building that college list and ways that you can begin to compare schools. I'm going to then gladly turn it over to our resident FAFSA expert. And Mila's then going to talk about, provide an overview of how financial aid works, the benefit of an impact or non-impact rather, she'll be sharing with you of saving when it comes to financial aid. She's going to talk about ways to save and some of the programs that we have available here specifically in Maine. We'll both be talking a little bit about the piecemeal approach and the importance of taking in a piecemeal approach when paying for college, and then some other resources and considerations. So we're really glad that you're here. The one thing I want to add, Mila and I are both parents of children who've been through this process. We've both been at FAME for over 14 years, I think 14 years for Mila, 15 years for me, and we have children that we've worked through this with. So we do bring a perspective, not only as professionals, but as parents who've had to sort of be in the hot seat and figure this all out like many of you have or are in the process of or will be. So we're really wanting to share those insights as well. Mila and I both serve as part of the college access and financial education team at FAME. So I also want to make clear that this isn't your only singular opportunity to receive help and support from FAME. Mila's team, she has a team of college access counselors who are available to provide one-on-one counseling and coaching through this process. You certainly don't have to go it alone. We're going to give you kind of a sampling of tips and resources tonight, but there are a whole host of resources, supports, counseling, again, one-on-one coaching that we provide through FAME. I encourage you to visit the FAME website at famemaine.com and you'll find our events page, our resources, just a whole set of supports and tools to help you through this process successfully and with as little student loan debt as possible. So that's what we're here for, and we want you to reach out to us, and everything that we offer is 100% free. So before I kick off my part of this, and again, we've divided this into two kind of parts. For those of you who aren't familiar with FAME, we just wanted to give you a quick overview of the Finance Authority of Maine. We are a quasi-independent state agency, and our primary mission is to support Maine families, Maine individuals and businesses in being successful. We provide financial solutions and resources, counseling, support, and outreach to help businesses and to help Maine families reach their educational goals. And so that's what we want you to know about FAME, and we hope that you'll reach out to us again after this presentation as well to learn more and to access the resources that we have available. So I'm going to start first by talking about, as I said, one of the key initial steps is to really begin to prepare financially and get, as we say, your financial house in order. And I see many comments in the chat. I'm not going to peek at that right now. But regardless of where you're at, as I said, in the life cycle, whether you have younger children who are younger than middle school, perhaps they're in middle school or they're already in college or maybe in college, regardless of where they're at in the cycle, all of these strategies that I'm going to be sharing are applicable. One of the things that you'll hear us say at FAME is it's never too late or too early to begin saving and planning. So if you have a child who's a senior and you're thinking, oh my goodness, I haven't done any of these things, it's never too late. We're here to help. We have resources to support you and help you, but we do want to give you some tips to be thinking about now. The other thing I want to mention is that these financial strategies and preparing financially, I don't want you to think are all isolated just to you. They're also strategies that you can share with the student, the child in your life. Many of these things are things that students can be doing as well to support the higher education, kind of paying for that college and beyond. So certainly share these strategies along the way. And many of them are going to be very obvious to you. You know, they're strategies that you're likely using in your everyday life already. So first and foremost, we think this is a great time to work towards paying off any debt that you may have, especially any debt that has a higher interest rate. Certainly any credit card debt or any higher interest rate debt that may be kind of preventing you from setting money aside. So really focusing on paying off debt is a really great strategy. Now isn't probably the best time. And again, depending on where you're at in this process, you may have a younger child. And so everybody's financial situation and family situation is different. But as your child approaches college and applying to college, probably not the best time to take on new debt or make big purchases. But again, that's a very broad statement, and your situation is very unique on its own. But it is a good time to kind of clean things up, to look at ways to maybe double up on payments, pay a little bit more off each month, focused on those higher interest rate debts, and begin to really reduce the overall amount of indebtedness. The other thing that we suggest, and this is another one I'll put an asterisk next to for students as well, especially if you have a child that's in high school, and that is to consider ways to increase your overall income, the money that you're bringing in to either save or pay off debt. For many people, that might be a side hustle or a side job. It may be increasing your income by selling products or services that you might be able to offer, using some of your talents or other interests. Obviously, if you could negotiate right now for a higher pay, that'd be great too. But there are other ways beyond just your regular everyday income. Again, those side hustles and those additional ways to make money. We also strongly encourage high school students to be working and saving while they're in high school and setting aside money to help contribute. We don't necessarily expect that students will be able to cover the full cost, but if they can help to contribute to room and board, not room and board necessarily, books and supplies, travel, those miscellaneous expenses, perhaps room and board depending on their situation, but anything that the student can be doing to increase their income and save that money for higher ed expenses will help as well. The other strategy that I think is very worthwhile, and every time I go through this process myself, I sort of kick myself and think, why didn't I do this sooner? And that is to complete an annual checkup of your fixed monthly expenses. So think of those expenses that you pay every single month. If you're like me, you might be the set it and forget it person who you're automatically paying. And so it's automatically for ease coming out of your checking account. Maybe you're not analyzing that as closely as you should. So going through and looking at your car insurance, your homeowners or renters insurance, your cell phone bill, your internet expenses, your streaming services, all of those subscriptions that you may or may not be using, and really evaluating whether or not there's money that you can save. It may also be negotiating your interest rate on your loans or credit cards. Perhaps you should be looking at refinancing or that sort of thing. So it can really pay off. I have found when it comes to home and car insurance in particular, I am astounded every time I have gone through this process to learn how much I can save. So I strongly encourage you to go through that process and use that earned or found money, if you will, to set that aside for debt that you may have and get that paid off. One of the strategies that I used, and this really wasn't something that, I really had thought much of in advance. I was someone who wished I had saved for college and put money into my son's 529 much earlier. But I hadn't. So, I wish I'd been that family where as soon as my child went into daycare, I diverted that daycare money right into saving for college, but I did not do that. And so when my son got into middle school and into high school, I thought, we're getting ready to take this on. I need to really build up that savings. And so what I did is I made a concerted effort to put every single extra dollar that I had into his 529 college savings account, almost to the point of being a little painful, that it was really as much as I could possibly manage and still get my bills paid. What that allowed me to do is allowed me to really build up money over the course of that 4-year time frame to contribute to his college costs. Then what happened is once he was in college, I scaled back on those contributions and I diverted that money into his tuition payment plan. So that was the opportunity that many colleges offer where you can spread the cost of tuition out over several months throughout the year rather than having to pay that huge tuition bill all at once. I was able to spread it out, but I had become accustomed to living without that extra money in my budget every single month. And so really it was, again, on a positive side, the set it and forget it, and really beginning to learn to live without it. So once I had to start paying, for those additional college expenses, I had already built that in. So that's a great strategy. Build up now and then get used to kind of that larger payment as much as to the extent possible. Another obvious suggestion is to really look at and evaluate your current spending, create a spending plan and a budget, and preferably look at creating one that is an example of what it might look like when you're paying for college tuition. Beginning to build that budget based on the assumption that you're paying tuition. And maybe that money, again, is going into a savings account or a 529 account for the time being, and then you're ready to pay. Another suggestion is to meet with an expert. I talked about FAME and all of the resources that we have available. I would strongly recommend opportunities for you to meet with your financial institution. They have wonderful experts available as well who can look at, potentially if you have various debt that you want to look at, maybe you're looking at consolidating, maybe you're looking at, refinancing. Financial institutions are a great resource to help you look at your overall financial picture. And particularly when it comes to getting debt paid down, they can help you build a plan. So I encourage you to do that. You may have access to a financial planner, a financial coach, or another expert that you can work with as well. And we encourage you to do that. Anything that you can do to tap into those resources, ideally free resources, to build a plan is very useful. And then creating that plan and strategy to save for college. And you're here tonight, so we already know that you're working toward that, and we're going to provide you with some tips to do so. Now, I want to also give you another free resource that's available to you. The Finance Authority of Maine has purchased, on behalf of all Mainers, an online financial wellness tool that's available. We have two versions of the tool. One is called iGrad, and that is for high school students and college students. And then we have another version called Enrich, which is for after college and for adults and adulthood and well into adulthood. And the nice thing about these tools is that they're free. First of all, they're online. You can use them 24/7. Completely 100% free. They're non-commercial, so you're not going to be bombarded with third-party marketing and emails as a result of joining. You'll see that the two web links are there for you to set up a free account. The thing that's really great about these resources is that you will, when you create the account, you'll complete a financial wellness checkup, and you'll tell the system and the online tool what some of your financial challenges are, some of your financial goals, what your stressors are, what's keeping you up at night. And when you log into the tool the next time, and even that time, you'll get a dashboard of recommended tools and resources that are available to you. There's a wonderful money personality tool that helps you get in touch with your money mindset. There's a series of financial wellness courses, videos, articles, just a whole host of resources available to you and your student that you can use for free. So I just wanted to put a plug in for that. Many financial institutions also have their own tools as well, but I wanted you to be aware of what FAME has to offer and that resource is free to you and your students. The other thing I want to put out there for your child, for you to use with them, is we have a couple of resources, one at FAME that we have created, and then another national resource I wanted you to be aware of. We have a tool called Claim Your Future that is available. It's for middle school and high school students. We even have some college students that use it. And what it does is it provides the student with an opportunity to explore various careers, various educational pathways, and financial decision making. So it actually will allow them to select a career and go through and actually do a monthly budget based on that monthly income that career offers. So I strongly encourage them to check out Claim Your Future. That's available at claimyourfuture.org. Check it out. It's a great, we refer to it as a game because students kind of enjoy simulating and testing out the different scenarios. There's 125 different careers on the website, and so students can go through and test out different careers and see what the financial outcome is and build a budget. The other resource that we love that is offered by the Department of Labor is Career One Stop. And this is a tool that you can go in and actually explore any career essentially that you're interested in, and it will give you a ton of information about the career. It will give you the skills and education that's required, any licensing, what a typical day in the life of that career is like. The other thing that it offers is the median income for that career, and it breaks it down by state. You can actually do a search based on the state of Maine and what is expected for that career. So I think these two resources in combination, depending on how old your child is, whether it's Claim Your Future, Career One Stop, or both, I think are great resources to help students get in touch with potential careers of interest, but also what is the income that they can expect tied to that specific career. And we think that's really important as you're making all of these financing decisions. So the other thing I want to talk about that is very critical, and again, regardless of the life stage that your child is in, and that is to begin having conversations about all of this early and often. We know that talking about money is still in many families a relatively taboo subject, one that, sometimes there's a lot of kind of embarrassment around it. If we don't have all of our financial ducks in a row, sometimes we don't want to talk about it. So there's sometimes a lot of hesitancy. There was a study several years ago that cited that when they surveyed parents, most parents would prefer to talk about the birds and the bees with their child than money. And so I think that really says a lot about our willingness to kind of put our cards on the table. But I think the more open in the conversations that you can have, the better off that your student will be as they, begin this college search process. And I think the better off they'll be as adults. Mila and I tend to be in the camp of really not holding back a whole lot. We're pretty candid and pretty obvious or honest about our finances with our children. And I know there's a spectrum in terms of comfort level around that, but I think it really has paid off. It's helped them to understand the value of a dollar, what our sort of ability to contribute is, and kind of, from an earnings perspective, being really honest about that, I think has been helpful. So I think as much as you can foster those early conversations, the better off that your child will be as they begin this process and, as I said, later on in life. I think another thing that's important as you are really thinking about this process is to really examine your own attitude and your money mindset when it comes to your dialogue around college costs and student loan debt. Think about what influenced you and your decision making and how that's kind of playing out in your sort of opinion about things. I think the one thing, and Mila's going to talk about this later, but things have really changed a lot. So for those of you who did, go to college, but it's been a few years, you need to really understand that the landscape is very different. Costs are very different. Financial aid is different. Student loan indebtedness has changed. The good old days of when you could, have a summer job and pay your tuition and room and board, those kinds of has passed. So you want to really think about your own attitude, your own experience, and how that will influence those conversations. And again, I think it's really helpful to really be clear about what you can contribute, what your sort of threshold is, and what your boundaries are in terms of what you can offer. I think another critical, and you're going to hear us repeat this, there'll be some things you'll hear us repeat throughout, and that is to really encourage your child to be open-minded and consider multiple pathways and have a backup plan. Don't get your heart set on that one scenario and that one option, and be flexible. I was working with a student recently who was top in her class, and I was so impressed with her and her wisdom and her openness. She was, thinking about highly selective schools. She was thinking about free community college. She was thinking about going to a public institution, thinking about living at home and commuting. She really had incredible flexibility and an open mind about all of her options. In the end, she got into a highly selective school that has great financial aid, meets 100% of need. We'll talk about that in a moment. And so she really did very well in the end, but she was very open to any option. She didn't have her heart set on one scenario. And that was really, I think, a great strategy to have. It's also for both of us, both Mila and I, for many families who've successfully gotten through this process, having that piecemeal approach, recognizing that you're probably going to be using multiple financing options. There isn't just a one financial aid option that gets you there. And so using a piecemeal approach and being open is a really great strategy. Having a conversation about student loans, and I think it's more than just talking with them about how student loans are can be expensive and you don't want to be saddled with student loans. I think really, rather than telling them, you want to show them some examples of what that might look like after they've borrowed student loans over the course of 2 or 4 years. We have a great calculator on the FAME website, which is a student loan salary calculator. It allows students to go in and put in their expected income, which again, they can grab that information from Career One Stop. They can put in that median income, and the calculator will then tell them the maximum amount of student loan that they should borrow based on that income. They can also put in the student loan amount and do the calculation in reverse. So I think showing them the impact of student loans, it's very hard for a student to think about $5,000 versus $10,000 versus $30,000 and what that really means in the end in terms of a monthly payment. So really showing them those calculations can be beneficial. And then lastly, getting the entire family involved in this conversation. One of my colleagues would have, and I thought this was such a great idea and wasn't something that I did, but she would host regular family meetings, money meetings, that they would talk about their family goals, whether it was an upcoming vacation or kind of financial strategies, things that they were working on. And so having that regular connection point, that regular opportunity to touch base is helpful as well. Getting the entire family involved in talking about financing isn't a bad idea either. As your child, gets older and they celebrate birthdays or graduation parties, that sort of thing, talking with other family members about contributing to their 529 account rather than purchasing, a random gift card or gift is another way to kind of build up that savings as well. So certainly we encourage you to do that. All right, so let's talk about the preparedness and how you can begin to research schools as well. And again, regardless of where you're at in this process, now is a really great time to begin researching schools. Now, obviously, when you're doing that research from a holistic perspective and from pursuing a specific college, you're looking at lots of different factors. Your student may be interested in specific degree programs. You'll be looking at the size of the school, the location, the type of the school. There's lots of things to search colleges based on. But we want to give you some tools that you can use to research colleges based on that financial aid perspective and how much money can you expect to pay based on that institution. The reason that it's important to begin this process as early as possible is because there isn't a one-size-fits-all financial aid award or college selection that again, schools can vary dramatically, and there isn't that one award letter that you can expect across all schools. And so we'll be talking about through the remainder of the presentation about the various types of financial aid that are available. But the one thing that I want you to remember is that is going to vary dramatically depending on the school that your student attends. Sometimes it's that high price school that has a lot of financial aid available to award that brings the cost down to an affordable level. And sometimes a lower cost school might be more expensive. So we're going to talk about tools and resources to help you get at that. Mila's going to touch on the merit-based and need-based aid a little more deeply. But just wanting you to have a sense that when you're doing the research, there are two general types of financial aid available, and they sort of are exactly the way that they sound. Your merit-based financial aid is going to be based on the student's academics, perhaps their GPA, their SAT scores. It may also be based on athletics or other, extracurriculars, but it's based on merit. Also, there is a category of aid called need-based aid, and this is the most common type of financial aid that's awarded. And need-based financial aid is based on the information that a family provides on the free application for federal student aid, the FAFSA, or the CSS profile if that is an application that the institution requires. In a nutshell, every school is going to require a FAFSA, and then some schools that have a sizable amount of financial aid of their own institutional money, might also require the CSS profile. In Maine, Colby, Bates, and Bowdoin are the only schools that require the profile, but virtually all schools are going to require the FAFSA. The FAFSA is used to determine need-based aid. And again, that merit-based aid is going to come through other factors. Sometimes students can receive a combination of the two as well. So how can you figure that out? How can you figure out what your student might expect? Well, there's some great tools to help you understand that. One of the ones I wanted to share is Net Price Calculator. Virtually every institution in the United States has a net price calculator tool on their website. The net price calculator tool will help you to determine the net price to attend an institution after, or essentially after grants and scholarships, not taking into account student loans. And so that net price calculator is a wonderful tool to help you get beyond just the sticker price. Again, as I said earlier, you don't want to just focus on that sticker price, because after financial aid, that could possibly bring the cost down significantly. And so Net Price Calculator will really help you to get a better sense of what you can expect to pay for a single year after grants and scholarships. What the institution will do is they'll look at their own kind of financial awarding formulas, and they'll look at that, look at available funding. They'll take into account the information that you're entering into the calculator and try to give you a net price. Some institutions will build in that merit aid and some will not. So you, again, want to be cautious of the fact that you're not going to rule out a school based on net price calculator results early on. You still have to wait to get through the financial aid process, but it gives you a ballpark. The other tool that we recommend that's offered by the Department of Education is the College Scorecard. And again, this is another tool that allows you to search and compare multiple colleges, including various degree programs, fields of study. One of the nice things about College Scorecard is it will give you anticipated earnings as well. So that's another nice tool to use. The last one, and I think this is one of our personal favorites, is a tool called Big Future. This is a college search tool that's provided by the College Board, and it allows you to search colleges on a variety of factors, all of the things I mentioned earlier: location, size, degree programs, all of the various things that you might be searching. But one of the other things is it has an affordability tab. And so it will allow you to research the school and determine what percent of your need, and I'm not going to dive into that right now because Mila's going to show you a quick and easy way to figure that out. The percent of need met, the Big Future site will give you what percent of your need the institution may meet. Some institutions meet 100% of your financial need. Some institutions are only able to meet perhaps 60%. So getting a sense of what available funds the institution can offer and what percent of need they might be able to offer can really make a big difference early on. And that will really help you to build that list. As I said, don't make final decisions based on net price calculator or any of these early tools. You have to go through the financial aid process to really get a true picture of what your student will be eligible for. As I said, the net price calculator tools don't always present the merit eligibility. So you want to be sure, again, that you go through the process and you wait and see what the institution can offer. What we have found in the past is that most of, or many of the very most selective schools don't offer merit aid. And that's in large part because most of their students are merit aid eligible. They're all our top students, and you're attending and able to get into that highly selective, most selective school. However, some of the institutions in that next tier, the very selective or selective, can often be a great source of merit aid and have that funding available. But again, you might not get that information upfront in the net price calculator. So just want you to be aware of that. And to reiterate again, as I said, we'll repeat ourselves a few times, having the student, building a list of, 5 or 6 or more schools, encouraging them to apply to multiple schools, being flexible, not getting their heart set on that one institution. When you go for the campus tour, don't buy the swag early on. Don't buy the sticker until you've really made a final decision. Don't get your heart set on that one institution. And be sure to have a financial aid safety school and plan on your list. That absolutely is a valuable strategy. And then lastly, before I turn it over to Mila, another very important stage in this process, as I said, don't make any final decisions until you've gotten through that admissions process. Student has been accepted, you get that financial aid offer. But when you do that, that's a really important time to really make sure that you're doing a careful analysis of what the institution has offered. This is another great time to reach out to FAME. We've got some great resources. We've got a comparing costs and financial aid offers resource on our website. This tool will help you to do an apples to apples comparison of aid offers. We want you to be focusing on direct costs after grants and scholarships, and then look at that loan obligation. This is another time where if you wanted to schedule a Zoom with us and help us kind of, work with us to go over it with you and do a comparison, we just want to be sure that you're really looking very closely at what's been offered, what the terms are. Is it an award that you can expect over the course of 4 years? What is the impact of outside scholarships? There's lots of questions that you want to be asking in that compare and decision-making time frame, and we just want you to know that we've got some great resources to help you. So with that, I'm going to take a breath, and I'm going to turn it over to Mila, because she's going to help to better explain how it all works. How does this financial aid process work, and that percent of need met that I talked about? How do institutions get to that figure?
Well, thank you so much, Mary. I'm so glad to be with you tonight. Thank you all for being here. I am going to repeat a few things that Mary said. There's a few things that we just think are so important that we find that people need to hear them a couple of times. And some people sometimes join us late. So when thinking about financial aid, what I really want to be sure you walk away from tonight with is understanding how the process works, and most specifically, what impacts financial aid eligibility and what doesn't. Because we've talked about savings, we're going to talk more about savings, but people come to the table sometimes with some myths. So we're going to focus on that in this section. So when thinking about financial aid, many times what people think about are those grants and scholarships, which are great because they're a fabulous way of funding higher education. Now, those merit scholarships, as Mary mentioned, are offered by the different departments. So the most common type of merit aid is the merit aid that's offered by the admissions office. So students apply to a particular school. The school says, if they have merit aid, the school says, hey, you're just the type of student we really want to have. We're going to give you a scholarship, and you can have that scholarship for 4 years as long as you keep your grades up. So that decision's made oftentimes, most of the time, in the admissions office. Sometimes athletic money is available to certain students. All these merit funds have no connection to how much money your family makes. It's all about the student. An academic department might have some merit money. My son's roommate went to a music school, and he was a fabulous trombone player. So his roommate received this great scholarship because they really wanted a student who's a great trombone player. So that's how merit aid works. And what's really important is to, when you're talking with schools, when you're researching schools, to specifically ask them about that. What you're going to find, in my experience, is that schools want to be able to be really flexible with their merit aid money. So you're not going to be able to go to the website sometimes and see the details about merit aid. So asking about that is incredibly important. And one of the other things that we want to convey to our students is that grades do matter. that merit aid is typically going to be based on having a certain GPA. Test scores are less of an issue than they were a few years ago. Some schools still use them, but the GPA absolutely is a huge factor in determining whether or not a student's going to get a merit scholarship. So that little carrot hopefully drifted in front of them can make a big difference. And so the merit scholarships are going to be awarded by departments outside of the financial aid office. The financial aid office is who is going to determine the need-based financial aid. They're going to make those decisions. They're going to get notified about any other aid, but they're going to make the decision about any of the aid that's going to be based on need, which is specifically based on the family's financial situation. So believe it or not, in the financial aid office, there's not a significant look at your student's grades. Your student has to have a certain, grade point average and be progressing towards a degree. But beyond that, that does not factor into how the financial aid office awards their need-based aid. Instead, it's based on filling out a form, specifically the FAFSA. So the free application for federal student aid, Mary's already mentioned it, but that's the form that all schools use to determine eligibility for federal financial aid and for state financial aid. And in Maine, most schools also use that to determine eligibility for any of their own institutional money. There are some schools like Bates, Bowdoin, and Colby, and lots of schools in the Boston area that require the CSS profile in addition, because the CSS profile asks some additional questions that the schools want to have when they're awarding their own money. For both types of applications, the end result is something called an expected family contribution. So you put in this information, it calculates everything based on a formula, and it spits out this number, this EFC, which is theoretically, again, what you can contribute. And then what each school is going to do is they're going to take that EFC, that expected family contribution, and they're going to use that to calculate financial need. So every school does this the same way. They take the cost of attendance. And so you can imagine there are some schools that have a relatively low cost of attendance, and then there are some schools that have an exceptionally high cost of attendance. That's going to vary by one school to another. Then they're going to subtract out that EFC. Now that EFC is the same, regardless of whether you're looking at a high price school or a low price school. And that's how each individual school is going to determine how much financial need your student has. And ideally, if we lived in a perfect world, schools would fill all of the need that you have. So here's an example of what you might see, or what we see sometimes when we're talking about different schools. So let's just say the EFC is $6,000, and let's say all of these schools only use the FAFSA. So the EFC is the same at every single school, but the cost is different. So we've got one school where the cost of attendance is $9,600. The EFC is $6,000, so there's $3,600 in need. The mid-price school, let's say that's a $23,500 school. Think our public state institutions, for example, and the EFC is $6,000 again. So that need is going to be $17,500. Well, then we've got our higher price school at $65,000. Again, the EFC is still $6,000, but the student has need of almost $60,000 in this case. So you can see why sometimes people will say, well, I'm not going to bother applying for financial aid because so-and-so did, and their situation's very similar, or even I had an older child and they didn't get anything. Well, part of the reason is because you might get, more aid at one school than another because you have more need at one school than another. That's why it's important to apply to a variety of schools so that you can see the choices in front of you. The cost of the school is not going to be what dictates, it's the sticker price of the school is not going to be what dictates what you actually pay in many, many cases. Now, how are schools going to fill that need? They're going to fill it with a variety of types of aid, grants, which are free monies that don't have to be repaid. Grants and scholarships are the best of all of the types of financial aid, federal student loans, and work study. And so some combination of that schools will use in order to fill that need. Now, if every school filled 100% of need, we probably wouldn't be here having the same conversation, because you wouldn't have to make the decision based simply on which school offered the best financial aid. If all of them offered all of the aid except for your EFC, that would mean that you could just simply focus on the academics and all of those other things. Unfortunately, the reality is that most schools do not meet full need. There are some that do, there's no doubt about that, but not all schools are able to meet full need. Now, they want to. It's not that they intentionally say, hey, we're not going to do this, but I really think about schools as being like families. Some schools have a lot of money, they have really large, significant endowments, and other schools just simply don't have those same resources. So what we find is that sometimes even our very lowest income students, even those students who have a 0 EFC, sometimes have a gap, and so they don't have all of the money that they need to pay for school. Middle income families, what the big challenge with middle income families is there's that expected contribution, and often it's higher than they think it should be. And I would agree with that. It is higher than it should be. And so we're going to talk about that more in just a moment. And as Mary referenced earlier, summer earnings just don't cover tuition to the extent that they used to. Even though salaries have gone up some, it just doesn't come close to what the increase has been in tuition over the last couple of decades. Just a little comparison, I went to school many, many years ago, let's just say back in the 80s. And I remember I went to the University of Maine, and the tuition for a semester was $750. So my total tuition, my junior year, was $1,500. And I waited tables in the summer. I could make $1,500 in the summer and just pay that. At Orono now, we're up over $10,000 or $11,000 for tuition for the year. So yeah, are there a handful of kids that might be able to make that in the summer? Maybe a few, but the vast majority can't. So how do families cope with this, knowing that it's a very different world than we all might have grown up in ourselves when we went to college? So we really like to focus on the savings piece. There are some things you can't control, and there are some things you can, and we completely get going through all of this, Mary and I. Savings is hard. It's really, really hard. It's it's not like I just say, hey, just do this. I do understand how difficult it is. But I also want you to know that if you can save any amount, it really does make a difference. The thing we often hear from people is that they feel like saving doesn't make sense because it's going to negatively impact their financial aid eligibility. So why save if it's just going to mean you're going to get less financial aid? And that is absolutely a myth, which we want to debunk tonight. So what I'd like to do now, Mary, if you could go to the next slide, is I want to give you a sense of what an EFC is going to look like. Now, caveat here, the FAFSA is changing dramatically. There's an overhaul coming to the FAFSA for the 24-25 academic year. So those of you who have juniors in high school or younger, there is going to be a new formula coming. So that's going to change this up a little bit. But what we find is when we look at this scenario, I've taken 4 different families. The families are the same in the sense that they all have 4 kids in college, 4 people in the family, 1 in college. And one family earns 60, one earns 80, one earns 100, and one earns 120,000. Now, when an EFC is calculated, what happens is there's a contribution from the income side of the house, and then there's a contribution from the asset side of the house. So the parent EFC is actually made up of a contribution from income and a contribution from assets. But to get started, we're going to assume that they have no assets. Okay, so we're just going to focus in on the income piece. Now, as you're looking at these, you probably are saying, oh my goodness, depending on where your income falls, you might be looking at this and saying, how in the world could they expect that I'm going to be able to come up with that? And we have these conversations about, do we want to share these numbers up front? Because we know they can feel a little frightening and overwhelming. But what we found is that we think it's better for you to be prepared for that and to know that earlier so that you can make decisions and have those conversations accordingly. We found that sometimes parents don't have any idea, and it's not until they file that FAFSA senior year and they are caught so off guard that it's just absolutely devastating. So knowing it a little bit ahead of time and preparing for it, we think that's a better way to go. Income is the biggest driver of the EFC. More than anything else, the EFC is driven by what the family's income is, specifically the family's AGI or adjusted gross income. Okay, so you can see kind of what the range is for EFCs as we look at those different income levels. Now here, what we've done is we've taken and we've said, okay, let's take that family that's earning $100,000 per year. So in all four of these scenarios, the income's the same. So the income is resulting in an EFC from income of $11,904, okay? So that's the portion of the EFC that's coming from their income, and it's the same in all scenarios. But what we wanted to do is add in savings. So if people are savings, what's that really going to do to the EFC? Now, before we talk about savings and assets, there's a really important point to mention, which is there are some significant assets that are completely excluded from the formula. So the value of your primary residence is completely excluded from the FAFSA. You do not have to figure out what your home is worth, how much you owe on it, or anything when you do the FAFSA, because it's completely excluded. Additionally, the value of your retirement funds that are sitting out there waiting for you to retire, that's completely excluded from the FAFSA as well. So for many families, their two biggest assets are already excluded. So that's really beneficial. But then if they do have some assets, what impact does that have? So let's look at that. So we have a scenario here where one family has zero in savings. And let's just talk about savings being just liquid cash assets, okay? So this family has nothing. They don't have a penny saved anywhere. So needless to say, there's no contribution or no expected contribution from their assets. So their EFC is going to be 11,900. And I do see a hand raised, so you hold on just one second and I will stop and take a break and take your question. This family here, they have the same income, but they've put away $10,000. Now, does $10,000 impact the EFC? Yep, a little bit, but only to the tune of $564. Scenario C, they have savings of $25,000. And so, yes, their EFC is going to go up a little bit, but only $1,400. And even the family who has $50,000 saved, their EFC is only going to go up by about $2,800. But think about this. Think about the options that family that's put away $50,000, which I didn't even come close to, believe me. But the family that was able to do that probably would be willing to say, you know what, we might lose a little bit in aid, but look at the options that exist. And I just think that probably most of you are imagining, wow, I didn't think it would have, I thought it would have more impact than that. So we just really want to get that word out there. I did see the question about 529s. So this is how a 529 would be counted. So let's just say you have $25,000 in a 529. That's your only asset. You're earning about $100,000. Then your EFC is going to consist of the $11,904 from your income, and then $1,400, a little more $1,400 from your 529. So that really is a minimal impact. But what happens, I think, so often with people is when they apply for financial aid, sometimes they don't get what they think they're going to get. And that's because schools can't meet 100% of that need. If they've saved, they think it's because they've saved that they're not getting more financial aid. But the reality is they weren't going to get that much more financial aid, even if they hadn't saved. But because they've saved, they've got these options available to them. So we just really hope that, to the extent that you can, you will consider savings. And we're going to talk about ways you can do that. But first, let me take a break and see what the questions are, Mary.
The only one I saw, Mila, was just to talk briefly about any other types of assets that aren't included beyond retirement and value of home. That's the only one I'm seeing right now.
Okay. Life insurance policies are excluded as well. So those are good. There is a shift with the new FAFSA. In the past, a small family-owned business with fewer than 100 full-time employees would not have counted on the FAFSA. That's an asset that would have been excluded, as well as the family farm. At the moment, those are no longer excluded, starting with the 24-25 FAFSA. There has been significant pushback on that. What I would say is that we all just need to keep our eyes open. You can reach out to us at any point in time to see if they make further adjustments to that. But right now, the big ones are your home and your retirement account, and then again, life insurance policy. So I think, retirement is one of those where families, can give some thought to it. Well, for a matter of fact, let me dive into this because we're going to talk about a couple common savings vehicles. And I'm going to jump down and then I'll come back up. But you can see a Roth IRA is an option. So a Roth IRA is, a strategy that my husband and I used, so we tried to do a little bit of all these different things, not knowing whether rules would change or what was going to work best. So we had Roth IRAs that we were putting some after-tax money into, and saying, okay, we can use those either for college or we can use them for our retirement. So we had some flexibility. And then the additional benefit is because they were retirement funds, they didn't have to be listed as an asset. So that's not really hiding them, but it's one strategy that you could take into account when you're trying to put your plan together. So the question a moment ago was about 529s. What a 529 is every state has one. We do here in Maine, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that in a moment. But a 529, believe it or not, if you went to section 529 of the IRS code, what you would see is where they talk about these plans. The idea behind these plans is you put in after-tax money. You make a decision within the confines of that particular plan how you want your money invested. Hopefully that money grows over time. And then if you use that money for higher education expenses, those qualified expenses, we'll talk about those in just a second, then you don't pay any taxes on the earnings. So it's a tax advantage way to save for higher education. So I will touch on Maine's plan in a moment and go into a little bit more detail about 529s. There's also Coverdell education savings accounts that can be used. Savings bonds, I have a few of those too for my kiddos. I don't think they're as popular these days, but they do still exist. You can have taxable savings and investment accounts, and I mean by that just your regular savings account at your bank. You can have a uniform gift to minors or uniform transfer to Minors Act, UTMAs and UCMAs. Those are not necessarily the best way to save for higher education, because one of the things I do want you to keep into account when you're saving is whose name are you saving in. Saving in a parent's name, like that example just showed a moment ago, has very little impact on financial aid eligibility. Saving in the student's name does have a bit more of an impact, okay? So it's not going to be that they expect a student to empty their whole savings account, not by any stretch, but it does have a little bit more impact than it does when a parent is the one who is saving. 529s, even when the parent is the owner and the student is the beneficiary, it's always counted as a parent asset, okay? So 529s are always counted in as a parent asset, so get that preferential treatment when it comes to the FAFSA formula. So these are some common ways to save. So, I think at the end of the day, we have thoughts on, sometimes there are some advantages to each. I almost thought I was going to freeze there for a second. There are some advantages to each, pros and cons. But I think that, for each family, they're a little bit different. And as long as you save something, you're going to be better off than if you didn't save at all. So one way to save is by using Maine's 529 program, which is referred to as NextGen. The station I'm listening to on the radio most days has been playing ads. So you might have heard them as well. So it is a 529. Anyone can actually open it. It's not limited to Maine residents, but there are some additional benefits for Maine residents. So we have a website, nextgenforme.com, where you can find all sorts of information. You can go to our website. We've got a ton of information there, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about it on each of the upcoming slides. But basically, I want to be full disclosure here. FAME does administer the NextGen program on behalf of the state of Maine. So sometimes people will say to me, so what does FAME do? And I jokingly, but seriously say basically what the state legislature and the governor tell us to do. So one of the things that we do administer on behalf of the state of Maine is the NextGen program. So I just want you to know that, okay? What we're gonna talk about here is how flexible 529 plans are. So that's one of the reasons why people really like them, is because they're tax advantaged, but they also are incredibly flexible in terms of where they can be used. So, for a lot of years, I think people thought 529, they thought 4-year college, right? That absolutely is one of the options, but it can also be used, those funds can also be used at 2-year schools, at trade schools, certainly for grad school, and for all sorts of different programs. And so it's not limited to only certain schools. And one thing it's not limited to either is schools here in the state of Maine. So 529 funds, including NextGen, can be used in-state, out-of-state, public schools, private schools, again, 2-year school, 4-year schools, graduate schools. For a matter of fact, they can even be used out of the country in some cases. We have, live right here next to Canada. I know lots of people who have gone to school in Canada, and many of those Canadian schools are eligible to have 529 funds used there. So very, very flexible in terms of where the funds can be used. Also very flexible in terms of what the funds can be used for. And when I say what can they be used for, what I mean is so that they keep that qualified status so that you don't have to pay taxes on the earnings. So in order to do that, qualified expenses include tuition and fees, books and supplies, the purchase of a computer or software or services. So imagine a scenario where your student is, maybe at the second half of their undergraduate education, they're junior or senior, they're living off campus. You can even use a 529 plan so they can have their internet at home. It goes that far and it's that flexible. They can use it for any required equipment. They can also use it for room and board as long as they're enrolled at least half time. And I don't mean just room and board on a college campus. So again, if they're living off campus, they can use it for their rent and to purchase their food. So lots and lots of flexibility as to how these funds can be used. Not on the slide, because tonight we're really focused on trying to pay for higher education. But I do want you to know that these funds can also be used if your student is going to, not an undergraduate, what am I trying to say? Tuition at an elementary or secondary, public, private, or even religious school. You can use up to $10,000 of a 529 plan there as well. And if someone were to have some money left over in their 529, they could even use that to pay down student loan debt that they borrowed. So my biggest point, there's no test, there's no quiz on this. My biggest point is I just want you to walk away knowing that 529 accounts are super flexible, both in where they can be used and for what purpose they can be used. Okay. And then back to Maine's plan specifically. Maine has 3 really exciting grant programs that are available. Now, in order to take advantage of this, when you open up a 529, either the owner of the account or the beneficiary has to be a Maine resident, not even both, but one of them has to. So people who are totally out of state who open up a NextGen account and no one lives in Maine, the student or the beneficiary or the owner of the account, they don't get these, but Maine residents do. And so let me just tell you a little bit about each of them. The first one is that there's an initial matching grant. And so basically, when you open up a NextGen account and you put in $25, automatically you get a $100 initial matching grant. And this is per beneficiary. So you can't, one beneficiary only gets one. You can't open up like 5 accounts and have the child get $500. But everyone who opens up one of these accounts with $25 automatically gets a $100 initial matching grant. Additionally, we talked a little bit earlier about setting it, forgetting it. We know how effective that can be. So we want to incentivize that. So anyone who sets up automated funding, and that can be through payroll deduction, or it can be through withdrawal from a checking or savings account on a schedule that you desire. Once you have 6 contributions, automatic contributions, you get a $100 automated funding grant. And then the one that I get most excited about is the fact that when you put in additional money over the long course of time, that's when it really starts to add up. So one thing that's been done to incentivize that is that when you make contributions on an annual basis, every single year at the end of the calendar year, that account is going to be evaluated to see what amount went into it. And then any amount that went into that account on an annual basis is going to be matched at 30 cents on the dollar up to a $300 matching grant. So for example, to maximize that grant, if you put $1,000 into that NextGen account over the course of a year from January through December, you are going to get a $300 matching grant. You put in $500, you're going to get a $150 matching grant. So this is the way that those funds can really start to add up, because this is not a one-time grant. This is an every single year grant. And one of the things that I want you to know about this is that you can continue to do this even when your child is in college. So I still have one in college and I still contribute to his NextGen account, even though I'm taking money out of it. I continue to put money into it just so I can get that maximum, $300 next step matching grant. What I love also, I love a lot about this program, but what I love also is that all of this happens automatically. I don't know about all of you, but if there's an additional form that I need to fill out, I might not do that. I might get so busy or just distracted that I'm not able to do that. All of these happen automatically. There is not an additional form that needs to be filled out. It's all watched on the back end. And when you're eligible for the grant, it is applied to the account. All right. So if there are any questions about NextGen, you can let me know, but check out the website because I think that's where you're going to find, just really, really good information. All right, so Mary mentioned the piecemeal approach. It's something that we're really big fans of, and I think this is where our own personal experience has helped us shape some of the stuff we talk about, because we literally would strategize about this, like, how are we going to do this ourselves? And so, we talked about all of the various options that were available, and the more we talked about it, maybe it's because I love pie. I start thinking about Thanksgiving, about the pumpkin pie, right? And you imagine that pumpkin pie, and if there's only 2 slices to it, those slices have to be pretty large, or are going to be pretty large. But what about if you slice it into 6 pieces? Then no one piece is quite as large. So what you can have is many smaller pieces. And when it comes to paying for college, having more smaller pieces can really be an effective way to pay for higher education. So we've already talked tonight about merit scholarships. We've already talked about need-based scholarships, and we've also talked about savings. And the other thing I want to say before we move on and talk about the other piecemeal approaches is that when it comes to savings, as parents, you don't have to do this alone. This is one of those times when Mary mentioned it already, we really want to encourage students and families and others to consider contributing to that account, whether it be for holidays or birthdays or graduations. That really makes a big difference. So you think about that, NextGen account and that $300, Next Step matching grant. If everyone throws in a little bit over birthdays and holidays, that can get you to getting that full $300 grant each year. So think about that as you're, planning, holidays and parties and things for your kids. Lots of times I think people are so excited to give money for this reason, because it's valuable, but it also says something really significant to the student, to the child. It says, we believe in you and we know that, this is going to be a pathway that's going to work for you, and we're going to help that happen. So what are some of those additional pieces? So student earnings are really important to discuss. Student earnings and what the plan is there. My oldest son, who is now 28, thankfully through school, full-time employment, it's all good. But when he first worked at Dunkin' Donuts, he was notorious for being the type of kid who has spent his paycheck before he worked his hours. And I don't know if any of you have kids in your life that are that way, but we had to have really serious conversations about not only the fact that he was working, which was great, but what he was doing with his money and what the expectations were. So if you want your kids to be working, all sorts of benefits to working, but if one of them is to save for college, I found it really necessary to make that very clear and very black and white. That's where those conversations are so important. Some kids just get it. He didn't just get it. So we did get there, but it took a little bit more effort than I might have originally anticipated. Another way of paying for higher education is scholarships. So we'd love to have you visit faymaine.com/scholarship. We have scholarships that are Maine based on that site, but we also have links to other scholarship searches, all of which are good, legitimate ones. They're not, scams. They're not going to be ones that are going to charge you any money to use them. We have a scholarship tracker. We have just a whole bunch of information on that site. So we'd love to have you check that out, because scholarships are another way of filling that need that a school doesn't meet. So if a school only meets 90% of your financial need, maybe that other 10% can be filled in with scholarships from outside sources. So that's a really good thing to be focused on, and to start early looking for those scholarships. Tuition payment plans are also another piece of that puzzle, or piece of that pie. Those are going to be those plans where you can determine how much you think you can contribute. You certainly don't have to pay the remaining balance at a school. You can simply say, in my budget, I think I can do $250 a month. And then what you can do is you can make those payments over the course of 4 or 5 months to pay a semester, or maybe 10 a year. Different schools structure them in different ways. But just like with the braces or with the oil bill, paying things over a period of time just makes it a little bit more manageable. And with the tuition payment plans, it's not a loan. So you're not paying any interest on this. There is a small enrollment fee, $35, $40 is pretty typical, but to have that flexibility, and again, have that be a portion, a way that you pay a portion of the bill can really be a successful strategy. I think something people don't always think about are education tax credits, because they don't necessarily help up front, but they can help as your student is going through school. So if I was really good, and I wasn't all of the years, but in a year that I was really good, we'd file our taxes. I could see that we'd gotten, more money back, because we had these tax credits because we'd paid for some schooling the year before. If I could then say, okay, if I got this much more money back because of that, I'm going to now take that money aside, and that's what I'm going to use to pay a portion of next fall's bill. Right. So right in the very beginning, it's not helpful, but as you continue to go through school, it really can be just another good source of a little bit of money to help pay down that balance. Of course, federal student loans are very typical and common for many students. You're going to find they're going to be built into a financial aid offer at most schools. The student themselves is who is borrowing these loans. They are not credit-based. As a parent, you are not a co-signer on these. The student gets them simply because they filed a FAFSA and are a matriculated college student, but they are limited. And one thing that parents don't always realize, students don't always realize, is students can't just borrow any amount that they want to. They are limited to that $5,500 per year. And that does go up a little bit, $6,500 second year, and then $7,500 in those last 2 years. And then there are other private loans. There are specifically PLUS loan, which would be a parent loan. The parent would be the borrower on those. But what you're going to find with those other loans is there is a credit component to them. These are loans that aren't secured. There's nothing to take back. So students cannot borrow these all on their own. They are going to need a creditworthy co-signer if they're going to borrow a private educational loan. Doesn't have to be parents, but they are going to need someone who can get through that credit process and be a co-borrower with them. So you can imagine if you have just even a little bit of all of these, suddenly it feels like, okay, we can do this, we can manage this instead of just really relying on one or two sources of financial aid. And then we're almost done, but what we want to think about too are things like the return on investment. So when we're thinking about schools and how much is affordable to an individual family, that's going to vary by family. I think one of the other things we need to think about is, what is the student going to be studying? What are they going to be earning after they graduate from college? I'd love to say that we don't need to think about those things. And for years, maybe I didn't. But financial aid is not awarded based on what the student is going to ultimately do. But borrowing should be. So if I have a student who's an engineer, I'm going to feel pretty comfortable that once they graduate, they're probably going to have a pretty good earning potential. But if they are going to be something like a social worker or a school teacher, which are wonderful, very, very needed careers, then I'm going to be more concerned about how much they borrow, because I just know that they don't have the likelihood of earning the same amount of money. So we've really got to look at that return on investment. And if you said to Mary or me, how much should we, borrow? That answer is going to vary depending on your specific situation, your student specific situation, and how much your student potentially will be earning after they graduate. And also how many jobs are going to be available. So if you think back to a slide that Mary showed earlier, the career one-stop, this is where they can kind of get a sense of, okay, how much am I going to be earning? And that can help them put all of this into perspective and figure out whether borrowing X number of dollars does make financial sense, or do they need to find another option where they can borrow a little bit less so they can feel like after they graduate, they've got many options ahead of them and they're not tied down by that debt. So we just basically want a scenario where students have as many options as possible. And that's everything from getting those good grades to keeping their options open, being flexible about the schools and their living situations, and all of those things. Having multiple pathways can really help students achieve their goal. With a handful of maybe, one or two very specific majors, there are so many pathways where students can achieve their goals. There's many schools that offer programs. There's many situations where students can be super successful, especially if they're willing to be open-minded. So I think what Mary said a few minutes ago about just not getting your heart set on a particular school or a particular plan is so important, so that you're able to think about all of those scenarios. And then last but not least, and then I'll let Mary maybe share our last resources, is that you want to think about how many kids you have and how many students you need to do this for and for how many years. So what we see sometimes is a family will say, well, we can do this, we can scrape together that money for that first year. Well, but what if the student's in a 4-year degree program? What's going to happen in years 2, 3, and 4? And I think one of the things that gets really challenging is, if a student is told they can go to a particular school, but then they have to transfer after the first year because the family can no longer afford it. Like, that is something I think people, you really want to think about. Is it better just not to go to that school at all and start somewhere else where you can also be really successful? And then thinking about how many kids there are. You've got 3 or 4 kids that are going to be going to college, multiplying that out. You do those things, then it allows you to put together a solid plan for your situation, knowing that your situation is unique to you, but we certainly can help provide those tools and resources. And I'll let Mary take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Mila. That was wonderful. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the FAME website has a ton of fabulous resources, both financial wellness focused, but also all of the wonderful supports that Mila and her team offer with FAFSA completion and getting through that financial aid process, comparing awards, everything from informational videos to events that you can sign up for, webinars. I mean, the sky is really the limit in terms of the FAFSA and financial aid resources that we have to offer. If you visit famemaine.com/build, you will find our financial wellness content and resources. I mentioned the Enrich tool as well. That is a free digital financial wellness tool. We have a publication that you can download the PDF of, or you can order a copy. And this is a guide, and it kind of takes you through the key steps to becoming financially savvy. Again, tons of tools and calculators. I mentioned the student loan salary calculator. We have that resource among several other tools and calculators available. And then, as Mila mentioned, savingforcollege.com is a great resource of college savings programs by state. Mila, we had a few questions.
Yeah.
One of them I answered in the chat, and that last little tip of savingforcollege.com reminded me of it. We had a question from someone who has a 529 in another state, and just to let others who are on the webinar know that you can have multiple 529 plans from multiple states. So you're not limited to one state. So if you've got another 529, but you want to take advantage of the grant programs that Mila highlighted, you can open up a second account. That's absolutely allowable within the program. The other question, Mila, was around, and I don't know if you saw it, it was in the Q&A. I certainly have my own thoughts, but what do you do with market volatility, and how do you address that? We're certainly not financial advisors by day or night. So, we have our personal thoughts on it, but, speaking to a financial professional, Mila, do you want to talk about the age-based portfolios that a lot of people are automatically set up in?
Yeah, so I have a couple thoughts, and then there was another question in the chat that I'll also address. So they're all kind of next gen related. One thing that I think about when it comes to market volatility and all of that is we've got shorter windows, but it's often having to do with the same sort of concepts that we use with retirement, which is if you've got time, we just need to all take a deep breath, right? My kids were kind of at the stage we are now in 2008, right? That you might be in. And I remember having this. It's like, okay, deep breath, we still don't need our money for a couple of years. One of the ways that people can invest in NextGen is that they can use age-based accounts. And what those age-based accounts is, they adjust automatically. So if you have children who are younger, then yes, they probably are invested a little bit more aggressively because you do have time on your side and you have time for the market to come back. Those of you who have kids who are older, if they have an age-based account, then what you're going to find is probably you're not seeing that sort of volatility because those funds have automatically been adjusted to be a little bit more conservative and not be as risk-based. So a lot of people, again, Mary and I are not financial professionals. I can't share advice or recommendations, but knowing that there are some age-based accounts available as an option, that sometimes lets people feel like, okay. And there are options that are very safe too. So if you're someone who just doesn't want to do any risk, those options exist. So before you ever invest, you're going to want to be sure that you explore those. One other thing, Mary, that I also wanted to mention about the person who has a 529 out of state, you're right, you can have as many as you would like. You can keep the one that is there. But if you wanted to, another option is you could take one and you could roll it into a next gen account. So you can use your 529 funds from another 529 plan, roll them into a next gen account once you had opened that, and those would be eligible for those matching grants. Okay, so that next step matching grant, which is the 30% up to $300 per year. If you roll that in, that might get your full match in a year. So just something worth considering, not recommending it, but it is an option that exists. And then there's another question here about some confusion about next gen. It seems to me, I think you mean about the grant specifically, it seems to me that they're only good for kids who are born after January 1st of 2013. And that's not the case. So there's a couple of things that I think that might be contributing to that. One is there's something called the Alphon grant. So the Alphon grant is a program where every child born in Maine is eligible for $500 if they're born a Maine resident. And that happens pretty automatically. The money comes from the Alphon Foundation. They earmark it for your child. They invest it. And then when your child is ready to go on to higher education, those funds will be available. What happened is that program was created back in about 2008. In 2013, it was restructured. And I wonder if that's where the January 2013 date is coming in. And automatically, all of the babies born in Maine after January 1st of 2013 automatically get that $500 grant. Okay, so that program absolutely exists. We didn't focus on it tonight, but it's all linked together. And if you have more questions about it, happy to talk about that. Not only is NextGen available to your kids, who were born before January of 2013, and all of these grants available to them, they're actually available to you and I. So this 529 programs are not limited to kids that are under the age of 18. These 529 plans and NextGen are all available to all of us. So if any of you wanted to go back to school and even just take some classes or anything like that, these do not have an age limit on them. So there's not an age by which you have to have opened up a NextGen account. There's not an age by which you have to have spent the NextGen account or anything like that. So again, just a lot of flexibility in terms of, the use of a NextGen account. So I hope that helps. Let me know if there's if that didn't clarify that.
The other question, Myla, and I was going to answer this,
Okay.
on the chat, but others may benefit from it, is whether or not if grandparents open an account, can the parent open one with the same beneficiary? Would both beneficiaries get the 30% match?
No, and this is a really great question. Mary knows I learned this the hard way. So you are correct that you can have a grandparent open up an account and you can have parents open up an account. So that's fine. You have different owners with the same beneficiary. No problem there. But when it comes to the grants, the beneficiary can only get it once. And the way that it works with that 30% matching grant, the next step matching grant, it's whichever account has a contribution go into it first for that calendar year. So let's just say grandparents have an account, mom and dad has an account, and the first contribution is going into grandparents' account. That's the account that's going to be looked at when they're calculating that next step grant, that 30% grant. Nothing is going to get looked at in the parent's account. And I say that because my child had an account that my mother owned and one that I owned. And I put a very small contribution one year in January into the one that my mother owned. And then I put all the rest of my money into the one I owned. And when it came time for the grant, I didn't get what I thought. So I'm so glad you asked that question. So yes, very possible to have multiple accounts, but be very, very aware of where you're putting the money in January and making sure it's the one that you're going to want to be looked at for that matching grant each year.
Great. Well, thank you, Myla. And we'd love to thank Town and Country once again for having us.